Real estate investors and landlords have stopped investing in the city of St. Paul after the city implemented a new rent control policy. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's going over the consequences of implementing a new rent control policy within the city of St. Paul, Minnesota. Now, I've covered this topic before, but I found a great article that goes over exactly why the development just has dried up within the city. Now, a lot of people are like, oh, well, the landlords, the real estate developers, all these people are just being greedy, right? No, that's not the truth at all. The truth has to do more with financing, with banks, with, getting a proper return on investment, okay? And if a bank will not lend you the money to do your development, if a bank will not lend you money so that you can buy a property because the rent control policies, because the government controls in this city are so strict that you won't be able to make any money, you won't be able to pay the loan back, then you won't be able to do your project. It's pretty simple, okay? And anybody could have told you this stuff. No real estate investor, I'm not going to come in, right, with hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars of my own money and purchase a property within the city of St. Paul, fix it up, make it real nice, and then not be able to make any money off of it because of these stupid rent control policies. What kind of moron, what kind of business would do that? These businesses, they know what is necessary in order for you to be able to pay your loans back. And they know that with these policies in place, it makes it darn near impossible for these developments to be profitable, for landlords to be able to make money off of, commercial real estate, for any of this to work. So yeah, they've created a situation where now they're actually devaluing the property within the city limits, which will make the place worse. It will, just make development dry up. And hey, developers, they're not going to stop developing. They're just not going to do it within the city limits. So, if you wanted to create a dead zone within the city limits, then hey, your new rent control law is perfect. If you wanted to create a situation where the amount of housing stock greatly declined, then hey, that's exactly what you did with your stupid rent control laws, because you've created essentially a rent control island where within the city limits there's rent control, but in the entire rest of the metropolitan area there's not. And if I am a real estate investor or a real estate developer who wants to build a large apartment complex or whatever, I'm not going to do it within your city. I'm just not. I'm going to go right outside, to one of your suburbs that's just a few miles away, and we're going to find a nice place there where we don't have to deal with your ridiculous law, where we don't have to deal with government intervention into, our price controls into the property, okay? And, you're like, oh yeah, but people, they want to be here. Well, we can't be there if the bank won't finance us. But, I'm already on a rant. I'm just getting started. Now, before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button. Maybe leave a comment down below and let me know what you think. Are you surprised that these rent control policies have greatly curtailed development within the city of St. Paul, Minnesota? Okay? I'm not. I knew this was going to happen. I knew that immediately landlords, developers, and real estate investors were going to start backing out of projects. They were going to be, abandoning this place. And, it will only get worse as time goes by unless they get rid of it. I mean, they're trying to, we're going to modify it so that it exempts, new housing, so that, I know, because eventually that new housing will become old housing and it will be stuck under these rent control policies. So, the problem would still exist where people don't want to come in and do any redevelopment on old properties, and that will lead to the old properties just falling in disrepair, etc. Even if it brings in new development, it won't allow for redevelopment, and that creates another huge issue. So, the whole rent control thing is a disaster, and they just don't even realize how bad it is just yet. It'll probably take a good 20 years before they really see all of the negative consequences of it, and you start seeing some of the problems you've already seen in California and New York. Okay, now this article, it's coming from the Minnesota Post.com, and it says, in first month since passage of St. Paul rent control ordinance, housing construction is way down. Yeah, way down. It is down a lot. But let's get into the article and see what it says. When St. Paul's rent control ballot measure passed in November, it contained a unique provision for national rent control policies. There was no exception for new housing construction. Typically, in order to make sure that new homes still get financed and built, rent control policies only apply to older apartments, either exempting buildings for a certain period of time or only including buildings built before a certain date. The policy laid out in St. Paul referendum had no such exception. With the passage of the rent control ordinance, there is now a useful real-world experiment taking place. Was the conventional wisdom true that rent control would reduce housing construction? And if so, to what degree? Or is it possible to apply rent control to new housing without impacting the new apartments that cities like St. Paul need? Yeah, they should have known from the very beginning that even, if they had exempted new housing, there would be more construction, but it still would have affected new construction, okay? The rent control policies in general are extremely detrimental to real estate development. They drive costs up. And in a place like New York, that might work, but I don't think it's going to work in St. Paul, Minnesota. Okay? How could it when you have the city itself is part of a much, much larger metropolitan area of, I believe, right around 3 million people. And it is, a small portion of the population. I mean, I don't even think it makes up 20% of the whole metropolitan area in terms of population. So there are so many options for developers to invest elsewhere outside of the city limits and still be able to make the profit that they desire. Okay. So yeah, I mean, new development is going to dry up as people decide, hey, we're going to invest outside of here instead. Now, the city of Minneapolis is trying to pass their own rent control law, and a lot of developers, they could say, okay, well, we're going to invest in Minneapolis unless, of course, they pass their own rent control law too. But, otherwise, I would suggest that those developers just look out in the suburbs, because investing in either one of these very liberal cities is a complete waste of your time and money. Building permits are down over 80%. With 3 months of data on the books since the passage of the rent control measure in November, results are rather grim for anyone hoping for new apartment buildings in St. Paul. Compared to the same period during the previous year, multifamily building permits are down over 80%. Meanwhile, in Minneapolis, overall construction is up as the economy has rebounded. The data compiled by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development is based on building permit applications, which are tracked monthly by the U.S. Census Bureau. Overall, in the U.S., 2022 is looking to be the largest year for apartment construction in almost half a century. So yeah, apartment construction in the country is way up, okay? Even in the city right next to St. Paul, Minnesota, in Minneapolis, apartment construction is way up. But for some reason, apartment construction is down 80% within the city limits. And that reason is rent control. Okay, their new rent control law killed their development. And they should have known this was going to happen, but they didn't, because they had their heads stuffed up their butts, okay? They put this referendum on the ballots and allowed voters to vote on it. It shouldn't have even been a vote in the first place, because it's unworkable. It makes it so that development will just die within the city limits, okay? And yeah, of course it was going to get voted for, because I believe that St. Paul is a majority renter city. That means that there's more renters than there are homeowners who live within the city limits. And I believe the vote was like 53% to 47%. So it wasn't exactly like it was a huge gap, like, oh, it was 90%, 10% who were in favor of rent control. No, it was pretty close. But if you have more renters within the city limits who are, voting, then of course they're going to vote to keep their own rents super and artificially low, essentially, okay? So, yeah, they've created this problem. And even the mayor acknowledges that, hey, something needs to be done because our development is dying. And that's why they're writing this article, But, yeah, if they want proof positive, they could just look at the city right next door to them in Minneapolis, who doesn't have a rent control policy yet, and see that development is still way up. But I'm going to skip down a little bit because they go into, in this article, the financing reasons of why the whole rent control thing killed development. But let's go. The struggle for project financing. If you ask people working in housing development, they blame St. Paul's construction decline on the unavailability of financing for construction projects. For developers, there is often a delicate tension with working with lenders, bankers, and investors. New ideas like building housing without parking or without natural gas hookups, both of which are critical steps towards combating climate change, often require persuading reluctant lenders to take chances. The same conservative tendencies often apply for entire geographies, where lenders often refuse to finance projects in neighborhoods without any comparable investments. This can lead to decades without any new homes added to a community, as in this example from Minneapolis' Seward neighborhood. The problems faced by developers under St. Paul's strict rent control policy are similar. Because people making financing decisions view rent inflexibility as increasing risk, they have been simply leaving St. Paul construction projects by the wayside. As one St. Paul developer described during a recent roundtable discussion, it's a concern. So yeah, and see, this is exactly why they have to talk to landlords, they have to talk to real estate developers, they have to talk to lenders before they implement stupid policies up at the government level, okay? The government comes in there and they're like, okay, we're going to implement this climate change policy that says, hey, we're going to cut off all natural gas hookups, not realizing that, hey, a bank won't lend to a project that doesn't have natural gas hookups because they don't think the project will be profitable. So if a bank won't lend for the project, that means that the project won't get built. And they will instead lend their money elsewhere where these requirements aren't in place. So, yeah, because remember, all of this is about making money. Not just for the developers, not just for the landlords, but also for the lenders. So everyone has to be involved in these processes. If a government comes up and they say, okay, you have to follow X, Y, and Z rules in order to build something, okay, and then they think that, okay, now all the developers are going to go out and they're going to build following these rules, then they're living in a cave, okay? If those rules make it so that a project is not profitable, then they're not going to be funded, they're not going to be built, and exactly what happened in St. Paul will happen, where the development just dries up and there is no new development. So yeah, interesting article. This is the stuff that I was talking about months ago, and I'm not surprised one bit that real estate development is just basically dying there in the city.